I'll get started. What I'm talking about today is 3 strategies for effectively integrating water into sustainable community development. I've worked with a lot of communities nationwide to integrate water into sustainable community development and also studying what works and what doesn't. Part of my background is that I practice law in Texas in environmental, natural resources, land use, public law, and worked with a lot of communities there. Have served as a chairman of the Anaheim Planning Commission out in Anaheim, California, and have served on a lot of government task force and nonprofit boards and so forth. So there's been a lot of practical hands-on work, but then also in terms of my research, part of the whole idea of that is to really study about what works, what doesn't, and to then bring those lessons to communities that are addressing these issues. So hopefully today what I'll do is try to bring some of those insights. Some of what I have done over the years has dealt quite a bit with codes and ordinances. Of course, having practiced land use law and seeing how water issues are integrated, sometimes effectively, sometimes not so effectively, sometimes not at all, into codes and ordinances. However, Carol and Lauren are going to talk about that next after my presentation, and we have a lot of good materials on various kinds of examples and so forth. I'm going to mention a few of them very briefly, but instead what I want to talk about is more structural type of concerns, how to structure this integration effort in a way that might produce maximum effectiveness. So first of all, I want to talk about how communities first get involved into integrating water into community development and planning. And some, as we've heard, sometimes communities get kind of pulled into it, say for example through this particular Sustainable Communities grant and so forth. But a lot of communities find, as they're dealing with planning and development and growth and so forth, that they come across particular water issues. And a lot of times communities will start with a particular issue. So that there's 3 major categories of water issues that typically are the entry point. One is water supply issues, just basically not enough. Dealing with sources and protection of sources of water, groundwater aquifer levels or in-stream flows of rivers and so forth, lake and reservoir levels, the amounts and quantity of water, the reliability of water supplies, water supply infrastructure, and that sort of thing. Sometimes public or private control, privatization of public water systems and so forth, conservation, pricing, drought, and that sort of thing. And a lot of times the issues have to do with growth that is outpacing supplies or outpacing infrastructure capacity. And then the second major area has to deal with runoff for the most part, too much. MS4 permit requirements, CSOs, flooding, and of course the hazards issues that relate to flooding, maybe hazard planning requirements, polluted waterways, erosion and sediment, groundwater recharge, just too little recharge of aquifers, low impact development issues, green infrastructure, and the like. And a lot of times here we're talking about growth that is outpacing stormwater management capacity. And then the third issue that often comes up is restoration. The particular projects to restore altered or degraded waterways, wetlands, riparian lands, that sort of thing. And so usually communities have a particular issue or problem in mind. And that's how they come to it. And so in your handout, I have in the packet, there's a handout. If you're missing that, there's some more out here and so forth. But I just list a variety of different kinds of issues that we see communities raising. However, As things proceed, most communities end up finding that they need to take a more integrated approach to water resource issues as they integrate them into sustainable development. Oftentimes there is some risk of failure or at the very least minimal effectiveness if you are treating only one or two issues of a whole set of interconnected, interrelated issues. And so we know that water supply issues are interconnected with water quality issues, which are interconnected with watersheds and restoration issues, and so on and so forth. So a lot of times what we find is that as communities deal with this, the question is, how do you take a more integrated, holistic kind of approach? And yet, communities oftentimes need to make some choices about what to address. There are limits to being holistic and thorough, right? I mean, how are you going to develop a planning process that covers all of these different issues here on the list? There are resource issues, just financial resources, human resources, time, and so forth. There are expertise issues. Many of these different issues involve different areas of expertise. You have the sort of folks in place who can help you through that. The manageability of the process itself. People get overwhelmed with trying to tackle all of these different kinds of things and see the interconnections, and then also just political will and political forces. There may be pushback against addressing certain things. They may be seen as contrary to powerful political interest or to what political leaders want to focus on, and so forth. So one of the things as we sort of think about these, we want to think a little bit about something that might be called integrated modularity. Modularity, thinking of these as sort of modules so you can break down the issues in more manageable chunks, but looking at also the interconnections. And so you can work on them pieces at a time, modules at a time, and yet at the same time, you also have a plan, a process in place to interconnect them and integrate them. And so how do you do that? So our goals today are in this workshop generally are to integrate water concerns with sustainable community development strategies. That's of course what we're here for. But I also want to suggest that we have another goal, a second goal, which is to use strategies with long-term effectiveness. Okay, why? Well, we want to maximize the potential effectiveness of what we're doing. We don't want to spend a lot of time and effort in doing things that just aren't particularly effective, and this is especially true now, given fiscal constraints. The governments are facing fiscal constraints. You want to make your dollar go as far as you can. Political pressures. Let's see some results. Let's see some good outcomes, not just a lot of process and nice sounding language. Economic growth and development. Okay? Economic growth and development in the long run is going to be interconnected with the sustainability of our landscapes, of our communities, including aquatic sustainability. And so if we are adopting strategies that have minimal effectiveness, that's going to inhibit future growth and development in the long run in a sort of an infrastructure kind of way. Equity and participation. We want to create opportunities for a broad range of groups and people and neighborhoods and so forth in our communities to participate in sort of long-term planning and problem solving. Many interrelationships between nature and society. Okay, there's a lot of different ways that these issues are interconnected with nature and social systems, and so we want to think long-term about that. And then finally, being able to deal with uncertainties, unpredictabilities, and risks. This is related to some resilience, to hazards, to those sorts of issues. But more broadly, if we think short term, we oftentimes are not building for ourselves that capacity to adapt to changing, uncertain conditions and risk. So I want to suggest that there are 3 strategies that are worth considering for long-term effectiveness: wet growth tools, watershed planning and management processes, and adaptive planning methods. Your handout includes some sources. There are actually just those things I've done. There's a lot of stuff out there. So I mean, I could have created a very long bibliography, but I just put some stuff that I could just pull quickly of work that I've done. And also on the front page of the handout, there's my email and my phone number. I'm actually on sabbatical this year, so if you call that phone number some weeks into the future, I might listen to your message, so you won't reach me there. I have my center has an office over in the Urban and Public Affairs Department, and that's my getaway to actually get some research done. So email is usually the best way to reach me. But anyway, I just wanted to call your attention to those resources. First strategy, wet growth. What is wet growth? Wet growth is about communities throughout the U.S. being engaged in ways to integrate land use, water quality, and water supply. The term wet growth is something that I coined to describe this phenomenon back in 2001 when I began planning a national conference that was held actually in February of 2003 on wet growth out in California. It's co-sponsored by the American Planning Association, the Association of Environmental Professionals, the Environmental Law Institute, a bunch of environmental groups, businesses and industry, law firms, et cetera, et cetera. There's a bunch of sponsors, a big national conference. We had a bunch of people come in from all over the country, and it eventually led to a book that was published by the Environmental Law Institute, some scholarly articles, and then eventually, as I continue to work on this, Carol and Dustin Wallen, who's one of our dual degree students in law and urban planning that preceded Ryan and I, put together what's called Kentucky Wet Growth Tools for Sustainable Development. It's a handbook. It was funded by EPA, Section 319 grant. And it's very extensive, about 700 and some pages, but 400 of those pages are various kinds of ordinances and other examples and tools in the appendix. And you'll have links to that, and the modules that Ryan mentioned are ways to kind of present that more succinctly and so forth. Even though it says that it has a Kentucky focus, it's actually useful for any community. I mean, our particular task with the 319 grant was to get this out to Kentucky communities, but you can use it in any way. What we come up with here is really the idea that wet growth is a toolbox approach to this integration. That there are a variety of methods and tools that are available to communities that they can pull from and use as their circumstances dictate, as they need. I've listed on your handout a number of principles that sort of animate wet growth and so forth. You can take a look at those. I'm going to kind of call your attention to some major concepts, then 7 methods, and then 7 tools. Let me talk a little bit about the methods and tools and come back to the broader kind of principles in just a moment. The 7 methods are watershed planning, low-impact development, water conservation, green infrastructure, smart growth, land conservation, and adaptive reuse, which includes restoration, remediation, and reuse. I want to just point out, we're not going to go through all of these, but I'm going to talk about watershed planning in just a moment. Let me highlight that low-impact development is site planning and landscape design tools to manage stormwater runoff at the source and to restore original hydrological functions of landscapes after development. And green infrastructure is natural and engineered ecological systems that act as living infrastructure through a variety of techniques, approaches, technologies, and practices. You probably all know this already, but I find when I first introduce students to this, their eyes glaze over if I don't at least give a definition. So anyway, and you're going to hear more about various kinds of aspects of this, rain gardens, rooftop gardens, rain barrels, pervious pavement, and so forth, various kinds of vegetation, use of vegetation, and so forth. I want to point out that there are 7 tools with wet growth. The planning, so these are sort of big picture tools that can be used in different kinds of ways. Planning, regulation, incentives, markets, and private efforts, public infrastructure, impact assessment, participatory processes, and public education and engagement. My observation is that while wet growth is a toolbox approach and different communities draw on these, that you actually, in terms of these categories of tools, you really need to use all 7. Okay? In order to be effective in the long run, if you're just saying, okay, this is all going to be incentive and public education based, that you're only going to get so far. Or if you're focused all on planning and regulation and you don't have much public outreach, you don't have much in the way of incentives, you're not adapting your infrastructure and so forth, then you're only going to go so far. So that's just my observation. So some broader principles to emphasize here. First of all, integration. Obviously, that's the whole point here is integration. And not only are we talking about the integration of land use concerns, water quality concerns, and water supply concerns, but we're trying to integrate those concerns into planning, codes and ordinances, projects and infrastructure, public land development decisions and design, particular projects and very specific kinds of decisions that get made, and then also the engagement and education of the public. Okay, so in all of those, we're trying to give some attention to the interrelationship. I mentioned decisions, specific land development decisions and design. It's going to be very important. The plans think about wet growth. That broad policy objectives think about wet growth. That you're thinking about, you're thinking about standards and so forth. I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. But if you have a lot of sort of broad goals, and you're not making individual decisions on individual developments or projects or permit applications or subdivisions or that kind of thing with wet growth standards in mind, then your sort of general goals aren't going anywhere. Okay, so that's an area where we see a breakdown. We see this tendency to adopt broad policies and then to not implement them because we have this sort of incremental project by project approval in the land development process. Personally, I think that project by project decision making and the broad discretion that land use regulators have over zoning changes and permits and so forth is actually a good thing. I think that actually produces some adaptation and resilience in our land use system. So I'm not going to be a critic of that. Either I've law professor, scholar friends who all think, well, you need to have very strictly enforced definitive rules that force development to be more ecologically sustainable and so forth. And I just think that ends up not actually working that well in practice. We have no aspect of environmental law Okay, top-down federal command control regulation with no aspect of environmental law that doesn't have permits and variances and project-by-project decision-making. That's just inherent in the way that we structure public decision-making in this country, in our culture. Okay, so I'm not gonna say that we have to eliminate discretionary decision-making in land use. I just don't believe that. But I do think the standards for decision-making have to include wet growth principles. The land use practices have to be evaluated against aquatic sustainability. So that needs to be in assessment of the impact of proposed projects. It needs to be perhaps in performance standards. Okay, so one of the things that we see in some ordinances and so forth is that the development project has to retain stormwater on site such that the runoff post-development does not exceed the average runoff pre-development. Okay? And so we see that's a performance standard that can be built into codes. It needs to be incorporated into planning principles. Okay? If the comprehensive or general plan doesn't include these principles, then there's an inconsistency there. And then finally, it needs to be incorporated into evaluative standards, into feedback loops that allow us to evaluate whether we're actually implementing these wet growth principles. So I'm talking about the critical importance of integrating wet growth principles and standards into land use zoning, land use and zoning codes and ordinances, and then implementing them. In your handout, there's a list of 24 different types of regulatory tools. So this is just under sort of the regulatory tool component. There are 24 different types of regulatory tools here that communities can and do use. I'm not going to go through all these, but I'll just give you some of my favorite examples, which is oh gosh, does anybody know Fauquier County, Virginia? Is that right? Anybody know? Okay, we'll pretend it's right, pronounced correctly. Zoning ordinance that requires the utilization of low-impact development techniques with site development. Buffalo, Minnesota has a shoreland management overlay district ordinance. St. John's, Florida Water Management District has landscape water conservation ordinance guidelines that are incorporated into local ordinances within the St. John's Water Management District. Frederick, Maryland has a forest resource ordinance. Northbrook, Illinois has a tree protection and preservation ordinance. Here in Kentucky, the city of Oak Grove, despite our relatively anti-regulatory culture in Kentucky, actually has a stormwater management and control ordinance that, as I mentioned before, has this performance standard that requires developers to develop the site in such a way that the post-development stormwater runoff does not exceed the pre-development level. That's very impressive. One of my favorites is the Olympia, Washington Green Cove Basin Watershed Low-Impact Development Ordinance, which has done some very interesting things. Santa Fe, New Mexico is another place that has expressly talked about wet growth as what they're aiming to do in their land use policies and so forth. I'm going to leave for a different day the topic of takings and wet growth regulations. A lot of times when I talk about just wet growth, that's part of what I talk about. The bottom line here, but maybe we'll eventually have another workshop and there'll be an opportunity to talk about it. But the bottom line is that there will be plenty of people and interest groups and so forth that will contend that wet growth ordinances constitute takings of private property in the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. And there may be some that could, I won't say that there aren't, but for the most part, that the constitutional doctrine of takings allows for very extensive regulation of private property in using these kind of wet growth standards and so forth, as long as there's some economically viable use of the property left after the regulation. For the most part, that's not going to be a taking. However, the culture and politics of private property rights in the US are much more potent than the law of takings. Okay, so people throw around the takings doctrine and the law and the Supreme Court and so forth. Okay, and that's the language. What's really going on is the political pressure on local decision makers and the culture of private property rights in the US, which is very strong. And that varies from locality to locality. Sometimes it's very local specific. There's a sort of American culture in general, but it varies. I practiced in Texas, and boy, they love their private property rights in Texas, right? Okay, right? So it's kind of true here. California, okay, people like private property rights, but you know that your private property is going to be regulated. Zoning codes are pretty extensive and robust and so forth, okay? So some local culture. That's going to be important as we talk about some of these other efforts, such as watersheds and so forth. I want to just point one other thing out that I mentioned Olympia, Washington. And one of the things that's really interesting is that Washington has a state mandate is created by state law water resource inventory areas and has mandated watershed planning with attention to growth management in these water resource inventory areas that is a study-based approach. So they're mandated to study the impacts of land use and growth and so forth on their watersheds and adopt plans accordingly. And so that brings us to our sort of second second strategy for long-term effectiveness, which is the integration of what you're doing with watershed planning, management, and other sort of watershed-based institutions. Watershed institutions are a sort of outgrowth of an ecosystem-focused management or governance, the idea that we need to be managing human activities that affect ecosystems and that are affected by ecosystems at ecological scales and with attention to ecological functions. Watersheds are the hydrological ecosystems for surface waters and for water-land dynamics. So they become the appropriate scales for action. And what we find is that watershed health, integrity, and sustainability are inextricably connected with the health, integrity, and sustainability of our communities. And so we end up having a lot of focus on watersheds. Let me just back up. I'm sure everybody knows, but again, I'm used to students who give me the glazed eye look, which is, okay, watersheds, areas that, of land that drain to a common point on water, so they have geographic as well as hydrological characteristics, and they have nested scale, they're multi-scalar, so you have small catchments, a bunch of those nested within a sub-watershed, those nested within a watershed, those nested within a sub-basin, and those nested within large river basins. We see the proliferation of watershed institutions in the U.S. This is one of the most interesting, from my perspective, one of the most interesting developments of the last 20 or 30 years in terms of the environment, natural resources, and community development. We have 401 state statutory sections throughout the 50 states. I think D.C. and maybe Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Islands are in that database as well, that have watershed in the title, and almost 3,500, 3,423 statutory provisions with the term watershed in the text. So watersheds have made their way into the law, okay? But what I think is more important or more interesting is watershed institutions. Okay, not just, when we talk about institutions, we're talking about sort of rules and processes. They can be formal, they can be informal, and so it's not just organizations, but very oftentimes when we talk about watershed institutions, people tend to be referring to multi-stakeholder collaborative planning or management processes at the watershed level. Okay? This sort of collaborative, multi-stakeholder, often informal kind of planning and management process. Okay? And there's a lot of that. Okay? That's been a big part of the development of watershed institutions. But when we actually push on this a little bit more, we find there's a tremendous diversity of watershed institutions. Some of them are mostly collaborative, but some of them have a fair amount of conflict, and there's a back and forth between maybe litigation and collaboration. Okay? Some of them are involved top-down management. We see a number of federal resource management agencies that increasingly organize their management activities around watersheds, and then through that sort of top-down process involve different participants and stakeholders and so forth. Watershed institutions might develop plans, they might operate programs, they might promulgate or enforce regulations, and they might try to facilitate individual and organizational behaviors. I've given you sort of a long list here on your handout of various kinds of activities of watershed institutions. They're very diverse. So they might be focused more on restoration, or that might be the genesis of them. Some of them might be focused more on preservation, environmental protection, environmental preservation. Some of them might be more focused on resource conservation. Now again, sort of different focuses. And sorts of things, the California Bay Delta System, the CalFed process, the Everglades, right? The Mississippi River Basin Initiative, which is trying to deal with this Gulf hypoxia zone and all the runoff from all the states that feed into the entire Mississippi River Basin, from Montana to Pennsylvania and all the way down through the Ohio, Missouri, and Mississippi River Basins. Huge, huge effort and so forth. But they might be small micro-catchments. We had a process just out here in Oldham County, just east of Louisville, and with Darby Creek, that a group of my students helped in a class that helped them identify different wet growth options for their watershed plan. Okay, so when local communities are looking at watershed institutions as a opportunity to be involved or to partner or to integrate what they're doing in terms of sustainable community development or smart growth or those kinds of things. There are three kind of basic approaches that they could take. First of all, the local community could incorporate a watershed perspective into its planning, regulatory standards, infrastructure projects, and resource management. So basically, local community just starts thinking like a watershed, starts thinking in terms of the watershed health and integrity. Second possibility is that local community could link its planning, regulatory, infrastructure, resource management activities to existing or ongoing watershed problem-solving processes or governance structures. They're already there, they're already going on, and so hey, let's try to build bridges, build linkages, increase involvement and integration of the various kinds of sustainable development and wet growth and smart growth kinds of activities. The third is that maybe there's a need to create a new process or a new governance structure around watersheds. So there might not be much happening, and the local community might need to really generate something. Benefits, I mentioned that sort of ecological human scale, the watersheds are the appropriate geographic, ecological, and hydrological scale for addressing water-land dynamics, and also people are connected to watersheds, people and communities. You just look around at the number of various community groups that are organized around water. The Friends of the, Green River, or the Blue River Watershed Group, or when you get the idea, right? We see them all over. People think about, they might not think about watershed and exactly what a watershed means, but they think about themselves and their community in connection with water. And they identify the connection with water. So we see that there's a proliferation of those groups. Watershed processes and watershed institutions allow for the sharing of resources and risks. You have multiple participants, multiple sectors, public and private, and multiple jurisdictions oftentimes, okay? Oftentimes in multiple governmental units and so forth. And that allows, as all of those participants plan for and manage for sustainable development, sustainable communities, to be able to pool their resources and pool their risks and share them, as well as, by the way, among those resources is information and expertise. Watershed institutions, for the most part, are broadly participatory. I like to use the term multi-participant. We oftentimes usually hear the term multi-stakeholder, but sometimes stakeholder has a little bit of a feel to me of, well, you have to have like a financial stake, as like businesses and industry and so forth. I think we're all stakeholders in water. In watersheds. We all live in a watershed, right? And so we're all stakeholders. And so I like the term multi-participant, but whatever works and so forth. Watershed institutions often have significant collaborative capacity. As I've said before, they're not always all collaborative. We'll talk a little bit about that in just a second, but they have the potential for much more cooperative, informal problem solving. But also in terms of the participatory benefits, they allow for local framing of issues. Okay? If your community is a community where climate change skepticism is fairly strong culturally and politically, okay, what you more likely want to be talking about are things like drought planning, right? Or adaptation to climate variability, right? So that kind of thing, right? You can frame it in different kinds of ways. And this is there's a conference that back in April about helping the private sector adapt to climate change and so forth. And one of the key components that came out of the land use working group was the tremendous geographic variation in terms of local culture and politics and the framing of issues, and how it's important to be sensitive to that. Another issue, I'm sure the hazards folks love this, is the concept of coastal retreat. Okay, people don't like to retreat, right? There's a sort of a negative connotation, and that might be exactly what's going on, right? But maybe we need to look for different language, different ways to frame that are more, that engage people rather than create conflict and so forth. And so watershed planning processes, because they're broadly participatory, allow for more local framing of issues. Watershed processes are evolutionary. They evolve over time. They're iterative and so forth. So they have sort of, we see with most of them, not all of them, but most of them, long-term existence, long-term staying power, but flexible structures and processes. Which leads to the last point on that, which is adaptive capacity. Watershed institutions have proved remarkably resilient. And not only the institutions themselves have proved resilience because of their more local focus, their participatory focus, their they're more informal structure and so forth, but also that the work that they have done has contributed to the resilience of ecosystems and the resilience of communities, have allowed those communities to build capacity, network, social capital, social and scientific learning about the relationship between human communities and watersheds and so forth, but also to adopt some policies and programs that, that strengthen the functioning and the health of watersheds themselves and make them more resilient. There are some major issues though, okay? So I want to highlight some challenges, some problems with relying on watersheds. One is that you might end up with, in your particular community, multiple watershed planning and management processes. There might be a bunch of them going on. So around here, we've got Floyd's Fork, we've got Beargrass Creek, we've got a number of different kinds of watersheds just in this region with different kinds of planning processes and so forth going on. So, how do you get involved in all of them and so forth? And there's a related problem of a choice of scale. Do you work on kind of large basin kind of level, or do you work at multiple sort of sub-watershed levels? I mean, those are some significant choices. I guess generally what I would encourage here that seems to work best is, to the extent possible, take a multi-scalar approach, try to work at multiple scales, and also to integrate as much as possible. You may have to make some choices, but still, if that's possible, that tends to produce the best result in the long run. Second big problem is conflict and agreement issues. Okay, these are still political issues. Okay, we sometimes like to romanticize about watershed planning processes as these sort of multi-stakeholder groups where everybody comes together, joins hands, and sings Kumbaya, and we have a better watershed afterwards. Well, the conflict doesn't go away, the politics don't go away. There's also the problem of important stakeholders not being involved, opting out. Okay, that's a real risk that exists. On the other hand, what we found is there's some things that can help make these watershed efforts more effective. First of all is what's called the 80% rule. Okay, that the participants agree up front that issues get put on the table and solutions get adopted, incorporated into the plan and the activities and so forth, if 80% of the participants agree. Okay? If you can get agreement on this rule, okay, before you ever get into any of the issues, before you ever get into any of the solutions and so forth, then that becomes an objective, agreed upon standard that you can always come back to when some powerful interest says, well, I don't like this proposal. And we're like, okay, but we all agreed, 80%, and here 85% of the participants are in agreement that this is what we need to do. It tends to work. And the issues that might be significant but can't get 80% of the people to agree that they need to be addressed, you set those aside. You don't spend hours and days and weeks and so forth spinning your wheels about those issues. They might be important, but if you're just going to have a lot of conflict and back and forth, put those aside. Let's work on some other things. Creative brainstorming, trying to generate win-win solutions. Multi-party negotiation techniques. One of the problems that I see a lot of times is that participants in watershed planning processes are not particularly trained or well skilled in multi-party negotiation techniques. This is another area where that could be a whole workshop. I teach negotiation skills, and I teach in multi-negotiation and so forth. I've done this for different kinds of sort of community and nonprofit kinds of groups outside of the university, as well as with students and so forth. There are some great tools and techniques that work well. They're hard. I mean, it takes learning and practice and so forth, but they work. It's just that oftentimes the watershed groups aren't as well trained in them. And then the other final point is to remember that watershed processes are iterative, go back and forth between conflict and cooperation. So a lot of times it's just a matter of being patient and persistent. Okay? We like to take snapshots. Are we effective today or not? Well, we got to think more long term. These are iterative processes. Just because it falls apart today doesn't mean that a year and a half from now that whole process won't be resurrected and much stronger, and you can move forward at that point. Don't despair just because it's not looking particularly good today. There have been a number of large collaborative watershed efforts that have been declared dead, where the experts have just said, that's dead. Okay? And lo and behold, 2 or 3 years later, the experts look like total idiots because the process resurrects itself because there's a need, there's a demand for it. Third issue, actual implementation or action. That there's a tendency in watershed processes towards agreement on vague principles and goals without hard choices, without trade-offs, without concrete actions. What is needed here is some concrete actions and implementation, cost sharing and risk sharing, that sort of thing, and a commitment to not just have plans that sit on the shelf and that are never implemented, but that actually produce concrete results. These are hard to reach sometimes, but one of the things that can be helpful is to frame the hard choices in relationship to the alternatives. Okay, so again, in negotiation, we talk about best alternative to a negotiated agreement, or BATNA. Okay, and a lot of times people who, again, aren't very trained in negotiations aren't thinking in that way. But what happens if this ends up in court? Okay, what happens if a federal regulatory agency imposes a solution? What happens if we just do nothing and it's business as usual? Okay, what are the costs of that? Okay, now let's make some hard choices. That framing is important. And then finally, uncertainty and unpredictability. Plans fail, conditions change, environmental conditions, economic conditions, political conditions, social conditions, and knowledge and information and human cognitive capacity and organizational capacity are all limited. And so that's the kind of last point I want to get to, which is adaptive planning. Adaptive planning as a method. Adaptive planning is based on the idea that the past is not a predictor of the future. Change is coming, but we can't really predict the precise outcomes or their effects with great certainty. We have limited human cognition and management capacity. In water, we refer to this as stationarity is dead. The idea that aquatic conditions we have traditionally planned for aquatic conditions based on the idea that over time, aquatic conditions have, the watershed conditions, environmental conditions have fluctuated within a window or an envelope of ranges, okay? And then that's been past, that's been our past data. However, when we know about how nature works, about how the complex sort of nonlinear dynamics between social systems and ecological systems work, is that we have a disequilibrium concept. The idea that the future is uncertain and complex and nonlinear, which makes conventional planning very likely to fail. Okay? It makes conventional planning very likely to fail. What's conventional planning? Well, you gather a bunch of data based on past practice, you make some projections about the future, you set some goals and some implementation plans, you adopt it, and you just put it into motion. And the plan exists for some fairly lengthy period of time, and you achieve your goals, and lo and behold, it's done. Well, the natural world has different ideas. Works different ways. It doesn't work that way. Right? There are all sorts of unintended or unanticipated consequences. All sorts of changes, tipping points that are out there that we don't recognize. Institutions can't just implement the plan, they have to be adaptive, they have to be resilient. Planning is about planning under conditions of complexity of systems and actors, uncertainty and unpredictability, instability, dynamism, and rapid nonlinear change. I'm getting in the handout, there's some basics or comparisons. Let me just try to summarize what I think are, going to be 12 points. I'm going to kind of run through them quickly, but there's also links to the article about what are some of the features of this. You get a feel for it. And then I'm going to close with just a brief reference to the Santa Ana Integrated Watershed Plan, which is doing some of this. Okay, first, flexibility and tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty. The politics of this is tough. People want certainty. There's a basic human psychological desire for certainty, and then sort of you add the sort of political dynamics of that, and the law. I mean, the law is about sort of protecting security of private property rights, stability, predictability, all that kind of stuff. So altogether, that is a challenge to get folks to think in terms of ambiguity and uncertainty and build flexibility into the plan. But it's necessary. Use of scientific methods that account for uncertainty. Continuous monitoring, feedback loops, and learning. The idea is that as you start implementing the plan, you evaluate what's happening, and you adapt the plan as you go along. You have feedback loops that bring this information back to managers, implementers, and decision makers, and the plan gets adapted and tweaked and sometimes significantly altered. Although if you are doing this all along the way, you can make more incremental changes as you go. Ongoing iterative changes to the plan, holistic and flexible design of processes and plan, transdisciplinary approaches. It is important in adaptive planning to get out of our silos. Where the planners are over here, the transportation engineers are over here, the aquatic biologists over here, the landscape architects over here, the lawyers always messing up the process, right? I mean, you know, right? That's right. And then you got the politicians. What can you do with them, right? Okay, but no, I mean, right? And the issues are interconnected. Right? We have to develop team approaches, and again, that's a whole nother area. Is building. Is team building skills. How do you build and work together as a team? One of the things actually we work on quite a bit in the land use and planning law class because it's important, working across disciplines. Coordination of interdependent conditions, multi-participant engagement and networks, planning the process, not just the plan, multiple options embedded in the plan. So not just picking one choice, but create a menu of options that where then on the ground implementers can then make those decisions as under a set of standards and conditions as they arise at the time. Multiple criteria for decision and action. And then here's another one that's going to be tough politically, redundant resources. Okay, right now, in an era of fiscal constraints, right? We want to be as lean and efficient as possible. Okay, tremendous risk associated with uncertain change when you are that efficient and so forth. Actually, redundant resources ends up being more efficient when you take a long-term approach. unfortunately, political systems tend to take a short-term view, but I mean, look at nature. There's a fair amount of redundancy. Nature should not structure in a very lean, efficient way. There's a certain redundancy of resources because it gives you that capacity to adapt, that resiliency, and so forth. So that's another piece of it. I just want to mention that Santa Ana, this is the Santa Ana watershed, which is mostly Orange County, some of, I think, San Bernardino and Riverside counties as well, has developed an integrated watershed plan that expressly acknowledges climate change, impacts on water resources, and the relationship between growth and land development, and sort of the sustainability of that, and the sustainability of water resources. And they're in the plan, they're applying a variety of plausible models. So rather than just picking one model, they actually present a range of models, of plausible models, and how each scenario would play out. From there, they have integrated into their plan some adaptation strategies that includes envisioning the future of the watershed, developing governance and process features, and integrating strategies with multiple goals and objectives and multiple ways of reaching them. There's some weaknesses there. They haven't put much in the way of feedback loops and accountability mechanisms. It's not perfect. Okay? There are some problems there. But that's an example of a community that is attempting to enhance its long-term sustainability, the integration of community development and water resources by drawing on wet growth tools and methods, watershed planning and management, and adaptive planning methods. And so I sort of tossed that out there as an example. You know, we're sort of running short of time.
I think what we could do is we can have a couple questions, take a quick break, because I'm doing that at lunchtime.
Through lunch.
Through lunch. So we can, if you have more specific questions, we can ask him questions during lunchtime. Have a quick little break. Carol and I will regroup here in about 3 minutes after we have a couple questions. Does that sound like a good plan, folks? So. All right.
Okay. Yes. Yes.
Can you explain the BATNS and what is that acronym?
Okay.
I just want to make sure I have that right.
Best alternative to negotiated agreement.
Yeah.
Okay, and this is the BATNA is what happens if negotiation breaks down. You just can't get a negotiated agreement. What's the best alternative? What's the best thing that could happen if you can't get a negotiated agreement? You know, what's your best scenario if you go to court? What's your best scenario if it's just business as usual? And the reality is, I mean, I know it says your best alternative. Usually, it's not a very good alternative. So best isn't very positive. It's just it's the least bad of your alternatives. Okay, that helps you then in a negotiation set a bottom line, because a bottom line should be just one level above what your BATNA is. What's the least that you could live with and still be better off than if the negotiation broke down altogether? Okay? Now, hopefully you don't end up with the least that you could live with, right? Hopefully you end up somewhere better. And really, honestly, while there are trade-offs, and not every decision is win-win, a lot of times with these kinds of negotiations over growth and development, sustainable communities, water resources, water quality, the environment, all of that kind of stuff, there are so many different kinds of options out there if parties think creatively, if they share risk, if they make little trade-offs to get to broader situations, that there actually really are a lot of win-win opportunities. The sheer number of participants is a big burden. Okay, so it's one of the things that we teach in multi-party negotiation is about coalition building. You have to do it. I mean, it's just too hard to do. There are some other methods that contribute that aren't just purely negotiation. There's some deliberative methods and so on and so forth that go on. There's a lot of with watersheds, there's a lot of study that happens. There's sometimes just a lot about sort of figuring out, okay, what's happening with the watershed. What are our, water quality standards? What are our stream flows? What are our growth patterns? That kind of thing. So.
Is that what Santa Ana is doing when you said plausible models?
The plausible models, yeah, they actually. They got to the point where they could agree that they would apply the plausible models, and so then the actual application is a more scientific kind of endeavor, where you have climate scientists, hydrologists, and others sort of working on what the various models are. What counts as plausible or not, and then how would they play out. I mean, the thing is that while there is some variation among those models, interestingly enough, they all produce a range of futures that aren't particularly encouraging and heartwarming, right? I mean, that's the so rather than people disagreeing over the model and the science, okay, you say, okay, well, let's apply all of them, and under any of them. Right, that the future requires some planning and adaptation. Thanks.
Thank you very much.